Hello, and welcome to the Bigger Picture video with me, Sargon Nissan. I work for the Bretton project, which is a networker, information provider, and basically an NGO that works with global international civil society. What we work on is the IMF and the World Bank. We're a watchdog. Welcome to this Bigger Picture video. I'm going to be talking about the IMF and specifically conditionality. That may be familiar to anybody who has a passing interest in development as a key issue, particularly since the 1990s, in demanding greater justice and greater accountability of how developing countries are treated. However, this issue is going through a period of profound change. In some ways, I call it the postmodern IMF, because the IMF has become much more willing in some mechanisms and in some ways, including the publication of its own research, to acknowledge long-standing criticisms that have been made of its approach to conditionality. If you're familiar with the term the Washington Consensus, it almost seems as if it's rubbishing that legacy in terms of inequality, in terms of the role of women, in terms in particular related to low-income countries, of the need to protect vital social spending. I'm going to argue that actually that portrayal of the change in conditionality is not true on the ground as much as you might believe were you just to follow commentary and analysis of the IMF. So let me explain that and make my case. To understand conditionality, you have to understand how the IMF works. You have to understand its history, its governance, and its geopolitics that surrounds it. It was founded in 1944. It was, like the World Bank, actually founded as part of the original understanding of what we would call now the UN system. But it doesn't sit within the UN system, and it's certainly not governed like the General Assembly. You might say it's a little bit more like the Security Council, where a few important and crucially rich states have the most say, both literally, but also informally. So literally meaning they have the most votes, and in the case of the United States, the largest member by vote share, they can actually veto any major decision the IMF seeks to use. Does it ever use that veto? Hardly ever, because everybody knows the veto's there. So we have an institution which is both part of the formal structure of international financial governance and economic governance, but is also working a lot informally. And I'm going to argue that it's between these two roles that we see the same old IMF expressing these same power and political contradictions in a new environment. And that's where this idea that it's changing, perhaps more than I believe it really is, has emerged. So I said that the IMF is governed in what I would argue is an unfair way. It's essentially that something like 44 countries in sub-Saharan Africa have 5% of the votes, when you have a country like Japan having 5.8, the UK having 4.3, the United States having over 16%. So this is an institution which is not democratically governed. It's closer to $1, one vote, rather than one member, one vote. And this is a source of increasing tension with a number of growing developing countries. You may have heard of the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, and China, and South Africa, a grouping of developing countries which are now part of the G20. I've spoken about their role and influence in another Bigger Picture video if you're curious to hear more about that. But what that reality reflects is the pressure that the IMF is coming under. And a lot of people perceive this to mean that it is no longer simply a creature of Washington, as the argument that it was the main proponent of the Washington Consensus implied. So what is conditionality? In case you're not sure, it's when the IMF lends to a country which is in a state of crisis, it attaches conditions for reforms. These can be structural, such as privatization or liberalization of trade, for example, or they can be target-based, for example, meeting a certain deficit or surplus or other financial target. Since the 1980s, this has been most associated with structural adjustment. And a lot of social movements, also development experts in the 1980s, especially in the 1990s, with very high-profile protests associated with the G8 and with these Washington institutions, began to demand that the recipe that the Washington Consensus had defined, stabilization, that's where you lend the money, followed by liberalization, deregulation, and privatization, or so-called Washington Consensus, was inappropriate and counterproductive. So, is the IMF now a reform character? And we're really talking about since the financial crisis, but perhaps since 2000s. I would argue no. Christine Lagarde, who happens to be the managing director and the former finance minister of France, said this less than a year ago in April 2014. Structural adjustment? That was before my time. I have no idea what it is. We don't do that anymore. I beg to differ. IMF is often known in financial markets and around the world as standing for, and this is a joke, but not a very funny one, as many economists unfortunately don't perceive, it stands for it's mostly fiscal, because irrespective of the crisis it confronts, it seems to advise the same package, which is the four shuns I discussed earlier, particularly deregulation, liberalization, and privatization. It imposes an envelope, and it says to countries, this is your spending limit, don't go over it. It uses this approach now to say, we don't interfere in the internal decisions of countries. Countries have ownership, a key developmental term, so that they decide where their priorities are. Raise taxes on people, raise taxes on companies, lower social spending, or protect it. But what do we see in practice, especially since the financial crisis? New instruments. The IMF is using more insurance, it's using different types of loans. It's arguing that it uses less conditions because it counts them, even though I'm not sure that you can compare apples and pears as if they were a number of conditions. And it has, most crucially, very interesting new rhetoric on the role of women in the economy, problems of inequality, excessive cuts. But notice that they tend to say this only about very rich countries, not the poor ones, where the cuts seem to have the biggest and most drastic social effect. And also in a few areas, for example, on capital controls. But is it really changing? When you examine the lending, when you examine the conditions, whether you're talking about low-income countries or middle-income or high-income countries, because that's where the IMF is active now in a way that it never was before, you see that lending remains driven by rich country interests. And this was an accusation that was leveled at the IMF since the 1980s when it helped to bail out the Mexican economy and serendipitously save many American financial institutions at the same time. Many reforms are very familiar. If you look at the IMF's role in Europe recently, in the Troika role and in the Eurozone crisis, key amongst the recommendations and conditionalities were privatization. Sound familiar? Tax and subsidy reform, which tended to put the burden more on individuals and consumers than on corporates. Sound familiar? Labor deregulation. I won't make the joke again, but you can see that there's a lot that seems to be continuous, despite the successful generation of very positive headlines about how the IMF has understood, particularly since the financial crisis. So, in the view of many analysts in data looked at up until IMF lending until 2014, the fact that it has more money than it's ever had, has over 30 new agreements since 2009, and the content of those agreements reveal that perhaps they're not recommending low-income countries privatize. What have they got left to privatize in many cases? So you can move on when you have that sort of past. But when you look at the countries where they're active now, these conditions seem to be as salient and as unchanged as ever. So what's the IMF been doing? It's been, if you like, becoming a postmodern institution, understanding the difference between how it's perceived and what it does, and understanding how it has the freedom to impose conditions dependent on the way that it is perceived. And so what I would argue is that really the IMF has understood that after a period during the global boom, up until 2006, when the IMF's relevance was questioned, not because it did a bad job, because it simply was the end of the financial crisis era, well, that was premature. And since that moment, and since it failed itself in its core job to predict that financial crisis, we've seen it respond in different and changing times with strategies that are very unchanged and very little different from the ones they adopted before.